So I recently caught an interview with Joe Bonamassa where he'd talked about selling his two Dumbles that he had in the past. I think at the time he'd sold them to fund like a burst or something like this. And then he recently has started touring them again because he's bought some more. And he's talked about now having 8 Dumble amplifiers, including one that used to belong to Lowell George from Little Feat. Now, I don't know much about Little Feat. Apparently they were a huge inspiration for Joe Bonamassa with his slide playing. I know one of their tunes because I played it once for like a jam night sort of soul thing, which was Long Distance Love. Absolutely love that tune. Think it sounds incredible. I'm not sure if it's a Dumble actually used on that record itself, but now Joe Bonamassa is going to be touring that amplifier because basically since Lowell George passed away, this amp had just been sitting unused. He bought it. Now, that was what I was going to kind of talk about, owning 8 Dumbles, and then I found this piece of news in the middle of Norm's Rare Guitar interviews.
And now my dear friends, Drew Berlin and Matt Swanson, now they own the company, and they're going to be building a lot of really nice...
This channel is supported by TrueFire. Yeah. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. That was a piece of news a little while ago. I think there was a little bit of buzz, I think, because the Dumble.com domain went up and there was kind of this site that was saying that this was going to be kind of a place for information about Dumble amplifiers, and also I think it was kind of implied and assumed that Dumble were going to start protecting their trademark a little bit more now that it's kind of passed on ownership since Alexander Howard Dumble died. Howard Alexander Dumble? H-A-D. And then passed on this company through the estate. But turns out that Drew Berlin and one other guy that was mentioned has bought the company, and Norm's Rare Guitars and Joe seem to be saying basically in this video that Dumble are going to be building amps again. Not him, obviously, because he's passed away, but they're going to be building presumably from the schematics that maybe he had, and maybe with some additional insight, maybe some parts and that sort of stuff, which to me sounds quite interesting, because the Dumble clone industry has been really, I think, for the last sort of 10 years, a huge thing, maybe even longer than that, 10, 15 years. You've got players like Fuchs, Andy Fuchs, I think Henry at Red Plate, I think Bill and Eli at Two Rock. There's so many of these kind of amps that have Amplified Nation that have basically taken a huge amount of inspiration from the Dumble amps and the Dumble schematics that have been found. Blue de Tone, as well as Van Wielden, Peter Van Wielden, over in Europe. Like, these amps have been a thing of legend. I actually tried to explain to a couple of family members, my wife in particular. She was like, why on earth would an amp be worth that much? Well, I thought, well, there's like about 200 of them around. They're super rare, and they were expensive when they were being made anyway. So if you look at like old Dumble prices, they were already kind of premium. And we think about like Two Rock amps being expensive now. I think the Dumble amplifiers back then, I'll try and find the price list, were really, really expensive. And if you adjusted that for inflation, they'd be even more expensive. So, would you be interested at all in Dumble amps if they're making them again? And I don't know exactly how they're going to be pricing these, or if anyone normal is actually going to be able to actually buy these things. I think that's the cool thing about like the VHT D50, even though maybe it doesn't sound 100% like a Dumble, you know, at least it's kind of affordable. And I think some of the characteristics that you hear and see in these Dumble demos, I think give us a bit more of an impression about what it is that these amps maybe can do. And I think of like the Robin Ford amp that my buddy Jake Loosemore played on That Pedal Show, and Charlie Allen and Mick and Dan, and you think, okay, well that's maybe not sounding like Talk to Your Daughter, you know, like these records that have these amps on them, it's not just the raw amp tone that you're tending to be hearing, right? Whereas in the Lowell George, in the Norm and Joe Bonamassa video, where you're actually hearing that amp in front of a camera with Joe Bonamassa, it's definitely a different sound in my head than what I think of as like the classic Dumble tone. I don't know if you feel similarly. It's an amazing tone. And there was this moment where he backed off the volume, and it gives this amazing clean tone, and then you actually hear how much gain he's got when he rolls it back up. It's like, oh wow, that is pretty special, I think.
To your hands, heart,
exactly. But just an incredible piece of news that I hadn't really seen anyone particularly pick out, because I thought, well, that's an interesting nugget of information just tucked away in the middle of that pretty interesting video with Joe Bonamassa talking about Lowell George's amp that's now going to be coming back out on the road on tour with him. Yeah, I think it's cool that he's gigging this stuff, and Joe Bonamassa is definitely a guy who's spent, you know, a lifetime's worth of money on gear, you know, but is actually gigging the stuff. So in some ways, it's kind of like, that's, I guess, fairly cool to me. At least if you're going to spend all that money on that gear, to see it out, you know, on stages around the world, I think is a pretty cool thing. Whatever you think of Joe Bonamassa in particular, seems to be pretty self-aware, right? So yeah, Dumble amplifiers, sounds like they're on their way back. I think Trainwreck amps is a thing where, you know, like Trainwreck amps were similar to Dumble in some respects, in that they're very rare, there's only a few of them made, but they're actually still being made sort of today as well. I think, is it by a guy that used to sort of, or does know, or did know Ken Fisher, but I don't think that those modern creations that aren't actually connected to the person that originally kind of made Dumble or Trainwreck famous tend to get as much traction, because as I said, Trainwreck amps, you can still order those, right? So I don't know, let me know your thoughts on that. Does a Dumble amp not made by Dumble make much sense to you guys? And another point to make really was like that Joe Bonamassa and loads of people have said that he would tailor these amps to players, you know, in a lot of cases. And so, you know, he like says this Lowell George amp is very much like Strat sort of orientated, which was interesting to me. Although with like Robin Ford and I think to some extent Larry Colton, they would play different types of guitars through their Dumbles, right? And I think there is even a schematic that I've seen where Dumble had written down some of the settings that I think Larry had used, and kind of the settings that he'd used with the Strat. I'm not going to share those with you because I think they were shared with me in private. But yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. Let me know, have you ever tried a Dumble or a Dumble clone? Did you get what was going on, or did it not work for you? Each Dumble clone that I've tried, I found the cleans to be pretty amazing and huge sounding. The drives I've not found necessarily get to where I was looking for them to get. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I'm not playing at loud enough volumes. Didn't get to what I think of the Dumble tone, which is like that smooth, sustaining lead tone with quite a lot of gain. It was more kind of barky to me, the stuff that I've ended up trying. But I don't know if that's similar for everyone. And like people say, you know, if they are tailored for different people with different setups, then what your clone is based on might make a huge difference on whether it gets anywhere near that Dumble tone that you had in your mind. But yes, you could buy a Dumble amp maybe at some point in the future.